This is Daniel in the Lion's Den, which is one of the stories. So we're gonna look at Daniel today, and I guess my question as I started was, how many of you have heard of the musician Russ Taff? Anyone? No one's heard of Russ Taff and his song "Not Gonna Bow"? No. Like this just must be all like the Assemblies of God Pentecostal in me. I was going to play a video for you, but I'm not going to now because it probably wouldn't come through very well because the internet here is bad. But there's a guy named Russ Taff who sang in I guess it would have been in the 80s, sang a song. He's a Christian artist. It was around when the time, I don't know if you remember Stryper and Petra and early Michael W. Smith and Amy Grant. Now these clearly different world. You all, Amy Grant. Oh, okay, you're all like, oh, Amy Grant. She's a sellout, anyways. Just kidding. Anyway, Russ Taff was a singer, and he had this song called "Don't Bow," and it's all about Daniel and not bowing down to the statue of Nebuchadnezzar. And we actually did a human video to it. And so when I started preparing for Daniel this week, I have been singing this stupid song in my head. You know what? I'm going to see it. Let's just try. I want to see if I can share, just so you know you can experience the pain that I see. URL website. No, it's not going to share it. Let me see how. 1 second. Come back. Do you not see me when I do that?
Right. It disappeared.
Just disappears. All right, here we go. Let's try again. All right. Tell me, can you see the YouTube thing?
Yep.
Yes.
All right. Here we go. Can you hear the music or no?
No, it's black.
Huh. All right. Well, I'm not going to try. Nope, that's not it. Let's go back here. Stop sharing. Well, it's like 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide. And it goes into the solid gold, it must be a God they were told. And it goes into this sort of, and people are bowing and then everyone bowed and the rest of them stood, the 4 men stood up, and it was this big production. I will have to put a link somewhere and send it to you, maybe in this week's email, because it's a great video and it captures the perfect quintessential Christian music scene of the 80s that I was raised in. I wasn't allowed to listen to secular music. My mom thought it was evil. So I was only allowed to listen to Christian music. And so when my wife met me and Shannon met me, she thought I had zero knowledge of American music history. Anyway, it was a great music video that we did when I was in youth group, and really was quite formative, actually, in the sense of this idea of these 4 Hebrew young men who just stood their ground, and no matter what the persecution would come, even unto death, they would stand there and remain there. And strangely enough, as I've been reflecting on it over the last couple of days, I realized that was really more formative than I anticipated. The idea that instilled in me that faith is something that you stand up for, and even in the face of death or danger or peril, you don't compromise. So, all right, maybe we'll cut the video to start here. This is Daniel. Daniel is an interesting book. It falls, we've been talking about the past few weeks, and interestingly enough, it falls right around the time of the first Babylonian invasion, which would have roughly been, I guess, what did I put? In the early 500s BC. And I don't remember what the exact date was, but you remember when we were talking about Ezekiel was in the group of the first exiles that left? You remember that? So you had, we had Jeremiah predicting the whole thing. You had, Isaiah predicting the whole thing, but a little bit earlier, you had Jeremiah predicting the whole thing right as it was happening, and then it happened. You had Ezekiel, who was being sent out in exile after the first Babylonian invasion, and then the second Babylonian invasion is what sort of sealed the deal and destroyed the temple. So in this period, they believe that this book is sort of set, but there's also an argument, and we'll get into that when we look at the actual literary breakdown, because it's thought to actually have been written in two parts. And so the 1 through 6 was written, it has a different, there is unity in it in a number of ways, which makes people think that later on they took the first part of it and they put it all together. And the Dead Sea Scrolls and finding them there sort of validated some of the time and dating, but really they don't have a reliable dating, but somewhere in that, they thought it was actually constructed sort of in that 3rd century BCE, but it points back to that time around when the second, right before the second attack or siege on Jerusalem by the Babylonians. Daniel is considered a part of the Ketuvim, the writings, but strangely enough, it is also then one of the major prophets. So, but it is not in the prophetic books section. It's considered part of the writings, and probably in part because it was has a literary function, and it is the only apocalyptic book in the Old Testament. And actually gives a lot of background to New Testament apocalyptic thought. And by apocalyptic, I mean, one of the things I read defined it as visions of a heavenly court or divine culmination of history. So in other words, because of the sort of final judgment notion, when we talk about apocalyptics, there's that the heavenly court language is the idea that we'll stand in judgment or stand before some sort of determination of our eternity. But that there's this, but the other side of it, I think that we use more commonly is the idea of the culmination of history brought on by something divine outside of human. We're living in apocalyptic times. Is there's something meant to be divine intersecting. Could be a meteor heading toward the earth, that could still be apocalyptic, but the idea would be that God was like, yeah, I'm gonna throw a meteor at you and destroy everything. What else? It was thought to have been composed over like sort of composed together or put together by different groups at various different times. And that really went on between the fall and the attack around in 537 all the way to the second temple, the destruction of the second temple in 70 AD, or Common Era, if you prefer that. And we'll talk about those fragments and how they look differently. But in general, the idea behind it is that it was written about a period. It was composed in 2 different periods, and then it was compiled at some point. In some of the compilations, there's some verification that they found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. In the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew, it has 3 additional books. You have a book about Susanna, one about Bel and the dragon, one about the prayers of Azariah and 3 children. And again, that's part of that is thought to have been added later because obviously the Greek translation came later, but for whatever reason, when they were translating it, there were manuscripts that looked like they connected themselves to that. And they tend to be a little bit more, I guess, as side material. Again, I think that your reason, and I believe it, like Bel the Dragon is considered part of the Apocrypha. And the reason being just because at some point it was deemed not being instructional for or not from apostolic succession for New Testament or even Old Testament books to the prophets. Okay, so let's look at and let's consider it and like this. There are 2 ways to sort of dice up Daniel. In any way you do it, there's a literary side of it that says the first 6 chapters are stories about Daniel, and we'll come back to those. So just hold those there. 1 through 6 have these stories, and each story has its own individual arc, and they all sort of mirror, in some sense, 2 of the chapters are grouped together. But in this first part of the book, there is rhythm, and they sort of accomplish the same things in a way that give them the feel of one continuous story, but in reality they were not. So it's important to sort of be, in my assessment, they're better almost looked at as lessons unto themselves that all kind of say the same thing, but they're different things that happened during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar and on, that show God's protection over Jews even at the beginning of exile or during exile. And that's the first 6. The second 6, 7 through 12, are apocalyptic visions. And it gets a little strange, and again, I'm not this is like there's a convergence of the 2 things that I don't like about the Bible. The prophets, which I'm appreciating more on this run through, but I said before that the prophets never really did it for me, but I'm enjoying it now. But the prophets and then apocalyptic literature like Revelations, and they both find themselves in the same spot in these last six chapters. So they're fun to go through, and we'll kind of skim through them, and I'll point out a few things that are interesting about them. But in general, much of what those last 6 chapters represent are what carry over into the New Testament. They give rise to a whole what's called a millennialist perspective that relates to end times and the way we're experiencing it. And like, the last 30 years as Left Behind series or whatever those books were, or that were very popular, that was all. A lot of that would have been based out of the prophecies that were spoken in Daniel, and then felt they were realized, and we'll come to that again. And so that's the second part really. And so the second part deals with the idea that the things that were happening were going to end. And so, and not only that you have it then, you actually have it in several periods in history where they thought that, oh, well, this is the end, this is the culmination. No, this is the end, this is the culmination, and it continues to go on. And so there's this referential nature to Daniel about the end times and about how that functions in the life of the Christians during that period. What else do I want to say about that? One writer put it that the first 6 chapters are about Daniel and written possibly by others, but the prophecies that we see from 7 to 12 are by Daniel. So you get more of Daniel's voice in that second part. In the first part, Daniel is in relationship with the king and has a connection to him, and it seems like the king just thinks Daniel is the best thing since sliced bread. And in the second part, the notion of a king or earthly imperialism is put on the judgment seat, and it doesn't go well. So there's a stark contrast from the first part of the book sort of being very positive and almost like, hey, Jews and Babylonians are getting along together. And in the second part, it's kind of like the Babylonians are going down. In each of the first, as I'll note as we get into them, in each of the first 6 chapters, a hero or heroes are sort of lifted up, and they're the figures or the characters that show courage and boldness in their faith. But it really is sort of behind the scenes, this kind of idea of God is praised. But it's in a similar way that we find with the story of Joseph in his rise in Egypt and Potiphar, and how Joseph was instrumental in saving all of Israel before the period of slavery, of course. But that idea that they moved into Egypt and that God was present. Joseph names it a little bit more explicitly, but we see those same themes when we looked at Esther. in the fact that Esther, you see God's providential hand moving, and you see God act. Now in Daniel, it gives God far more credit and really makes God ultimately the ultimate hero. But the language it uses is not explicit, and it is almost poetic at times in how it does it. All right. The last thing I will say about just the literary structure is there's some that think that the reason that the book was ordered the way it is because then you have the first 6 chapters that are describing this character of Daniel, who's become this figure in the Babylonian Empire, and is honorable, and so it sort of builds his credibility, and then he has these visions, and so the idea is you establish credibility and then you present the visions, because if you start with the visions, then you just look crazy. So that was the last part was my take. All right. So now then the other part that is interesting about this book is that there are linguistic features that shape it. And if you look, and this is, again, they've parceled it, but in the very first chapter, it's not the whole first chapter, 1 through 2:4. So in the first 4 chapters of the first 4 verses of the second chapter, they were all written in Hebrew. And then from 2:5 or 2:4b, I guess, to 7-ish, basically right before 8, it's written in Aramaic. And Aramaic is a similar language to Hebrew, but all of the manuscripts that were used to construct the book of Daniel were in Aramaic. And then from the 8 to 12, it flips back to Hebrew. And so there's been much discussion about, like, why is this there? Why would they switch over? And there really isn't much resolution other than the thought that perhaps originally that chapter 1 was enough of an introduction to Daniel than to bring the prophecies. But then, if they ordered in that way to establish credibility, and then to bring the visions, and then as these other stories that connected to Daniel's heroism, if you will, or his courageousness, then they had to stick them somewhere. And so by sticking them in between, the idea was not necessarily to separate the language, but to say, hey, these are accounts as well that deal with Daniel and his 3 friends. All right. Anything else that you have questions on in that area?
I do have a question. Have you ever heard that Daniel and his friends may have been the source of the information that the wise men, the Magi, drew from to know about the prophecy of a king, that they had brought some information with them when they were captive there, that because they were included in that king's group of wise young men, and that included astrologers and magicians, that they could have planted that prophecy there, that centuries later led to the Magi coming, and that they felt that prophecy was then fulfilled.
I have read that suggested, and I think that is highly likely, given the fact that the court in Babylon was eventually taken over by Persian. And actually it describes, there's in one of the chapters in Daniel, it says there are going to be 4 kings or 4 reigns that will come, and the final one was thought to be Cyrus. Mm-hmm. Which means if the folklore through 4 kings, or the tales of 4 kings, whether you assume these are true or folklore, I tend to take things at face value, and unless otherwise proven, I should. So presuming that these are actual miracles that happened during the time of King Nebuchadnezzar with these 4 Jewish gentlemen, then those would have been things that would have shaped the perception of the kings, but at some to extent, Well, there's also a madness present in some of these kings that makes them seem like they were off. I'm sure they probably were, but I think it's the idea, and it does, and it portrays in one of the chapters this idea, again, not only of a savior, but when all the prophets sort of have some inkling of it, but you see this prophetic realm of the judgment on the nations from God. And actually in one of the visions, it's pretty direct that God was going to crush the nations. And so, yeah, I think that there's weight in that, the idea that could be passed on, in particular, because one of the kings was thought to be Persian. You know, and again, we don't really know what ethnicities the kings were. And we don't even know if there were 3, there could have been 20. Which reminds me, actually, at one point I started designing a board game about a whole you have a whole bunch of camels that represent kings, and you're trying to get them, they're all trying to make it, but only 3 are going to make it in the end. So will you be one of those 3? But you got to pick up your gold and frankincense and myrrh first. See, you can gamify anything. All right, but yeah, no, I think that's just in that Persian connection. I think that would be very possible, and I think in general, the sort of scholarship and magician and wisdom astrologer stuff, my guess is probably was shared. There were connections amongst the folklore and the practice of those things throughout those ages as well. There's probably like a magicians and astrologers convention they held in Egypt or something. Okay. Any other questions? No. Well, let's look at the book itself, and we'll go through it. I thought it was interesting, and I didn't know this, and I don't remember ever reading this, that we say Daniel, and then we say Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Those are those 3 names that stick out in your head from the Bible. Did you say those as kids, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego?
Yes.
No.
We did. We did.
No.
Catholics didn't.
And you didn't? Did anyone? And I apologize beforehand if this is offensive to anyone, but did anyone ever say as kids, "My shack, your shack, and to bed we go"? Did you ever hear that?
Yep.
Yeah. That was the I was a good old Assemblies of God Pentecostal kid, and that was like you were a bad boy if you were telling jokes like that. Anyway, what I thought was interesting was that Daniel is considered to be the Hebrew name, but his companions, if you look closely at the text, are actually Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Those are the Hebrew names, but and then Daniel's name actually was Belshazzar in Babylon, and then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were the Babylonian names they were given once they were in court. But what's interesting about that is, for whatever reason, we use the Hebrew name for Daniel, but we use the Babylonian names for his buddies that were with him there. Okay. I wanted to just make a few notes just about the general theme. The whole time that we have all of these prophets in the beginning of these exiles, they're all sort of in a similar era. They're all saying the same things, and they're all obviously not everyone's going to hear every prophecy because they didn't have the internet. They're not sending it out by email, so they're on the corners and street corners, and they're saying, in order to hear this person, they're repeating it. So at some point, these people who are shouting these prophecies and telling these prophecies, are in the corners looking like madmen. But there's something about this book, though, that draws attention in a very redemptive way, that almost each of the first 6 stories function as like their own little vignettes that were probably used to reassure exiled Jews that hope was on the other side. That faithful living, these are like I said many times throughout these Bible studies, that sometimes we try to make a character lesson or a moral lesson or ethical lesson out of a Bible character. Well, I mean, these were used in that way specifically for Jewish catechesis to re-emphasize the idea that if you are obedient and stand in good faith and do what you're called to, God will save and keep you. as opposed to the rest of these books that we've been reading around the prophetic times, that all are sort of doom and gloom and awful, and and sort of just leave you feeling yucky. So this, in some way, Daniel's kind of one of the happier prophetic books, because it portrays obedience, it portrays blessing, and it portrays future hope and resurrection and the conquering of other nations in the second half, as we'll see. And so Israel could read these and use these stories, and they were used to shape their identity and to give them some sense of hope. If you have your Bibles with you, go ahead and turn to chapter 1. And this is kind of the very beginning of the story, and it tells you a little bit how they were chosen to serve for the king, and they were honored in the Babylonian court, and that they were, and you can just, and so it dates it here during the reign of Jehoiakim, and King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. Right there, you have the dating and the time of it in terms of, but it's not thought to actually have been written during this time, just to be clear, but it's thought to have been happened during this time, or it was a retelling of. The king of go down a little bit. Then the king commanded, verse 3, the king commanded his palace master to bring some of the Israelites to the royal family and nobility, young men without physical defect and handsome, versed in every branch of wisdom, endowed with knowledge and insight, and competent to serve in the king's palace. They were to be taught the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them daily portions to the royal rations of food and wine, and they were educated for 3 years. So at the end of the time, they could be stationed at the king's court. Among them, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah from the tribe of Judah, again, from the southern kingdom. The palace master gave them other names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. Which is funny, again, that we'd use Daniel and then we switch back over to their Babylonian names. But then it goes into the first story, and sets the stage. They've been risen in the courts, and they've been selected as just really top quality Jews. Find the best. But the king's like, find me the best you can. And my guess is they were for political purposes. Let's get some spokesmen and educate them in our ways, and they become translators and help to lead people. So they're essentially leaders. I don't think it was so much that the king's like, hey, we'll train these folks because someday they're going to do some vision interpretation, but just because they were really trying to bring some Jews into the court. So what you have in the first is the Jewish food laws contradicted with the Babylonian diet, and they came and they said, oh, Daniel would not. He said Daniel wouldn't vile it, and Daniel got in trouble for it, and he said, the king said, basically, let's test for 10 days. We'll be given vegetables and to eat and water to drink, and you can compare our appearance to that of your young men of the royal nation. So I don't know if what kind of vegetables they were super, I've heard people the Daniel diet where they talk about these grasses that they ate, but the idea behind it is that they looked so great at the end that the king was like, hey, we will not persecute you and tell you what to eat. And then it says in 20, in every matter of wisdom, understanding concerning the king inquired of them. He found them 10 times better than the magicians and enhancers in his whole kingdom. And that's a huge kingdom. And Daniel continued there until the first year of Cyrus. So there you go, Glenda. If Daniel was there until the first year of Cyrus, that means that's the Persian connection to the story connecting to, because Daniel would have been able to say to Cyrus, these are the tales of what happened before. So what you have to that is an introduction. You see Daniel not eating the diet required by Babylonians and being rewarded for that, and he and his buddies are being accelerated or advanced in the kingdom. Chapter 2 goes into the dream sequence, which I think is fascinating, because the king has a dream and he brings all his wise men there, and he doesn't want them to trick him and just make something up. And so he says to them, you tell me the dream that I had, and if you can't tell me the dream that I had, I'm going to rip you from limb. It literally says from you shall be torn from limb to limb, and your houses shall be laid to ruin. Which, let's just stop there. That seems a little extreme, doesn't it? Like, if you can't tell me what is in my head and then I had a dream, then everyone dies, and you're going to your house, and all, not just you as wise, scholars and astrologers, but your families too, and we're going to burn everything to the ground. So just right from the beginning, you can sort of, from a modern mindset, look at this king as being pretty crazy. And then it goes on, and he said that, and so and when none of them can, he sentences them to death. Where is it then? Because no one could say anything, he went into a rage, and he commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be destroyed. And then he was and they looked for Daniel and his companions to execute them, which actually is interesting. There's a comma there, and it says, and they looked for Daniel and his companions, comma, to execute them, which means it's modifying Daniel and his friends. But if the comma wasn't there, which the first time I read it, I was like, that's not how the story went. I thought they were asking Daniel and his friends to do the execution. Again, carefully placed commas. So Daniel, because they were considered a part of the wise men of court in Persia, were thrown into this mix, and Daniel says, hey, let me have one shot at this. So Daniel goes and basically tells the king what the dream was. Before that, he says in verse 27, no wise men, enchanters, magicians, or diviners can show the king the mystery the king is asking, but there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has disclosed to King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in the end days. Your dream and vision of your head, as you lay on the bed, were these. And it basically, and then he goes on and he tells them the statue, or a dream, and what the dream is of a statue that was huge. Its brilliance was extraordinary. It was standing before you, and its appearance was frightening. The head of the statue was fine gold, and that is meant to symbolize King Nebuchadnezzar. And its arms and silvers, and its middles and its thighs of bronze, and its legs of iron, its feet apart, partly of iron and partly of clay, which represents, I guess, the brokenness of the two king of the nations intermingling. As you look at the stone was cut not by human hands, and basically it was struck. It struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. And then from the iron and clay and the bronze and the silver and the gold were all broken and became like chaff of the summer threshing floors. And so basically what he's saying is that these are the kingdoms that will follow. And he says on the fourth kingdom, there will be something different will happen. Where is it? Should rise down in 38, and those who have given those into his hand he has given human beings wherever they live, the wild animals of the fields and the birds of the air, and whom he's established as rulers of them all. You are the head of gold. So that's Nebuchadnezzar. After you shall rise another kingdom inferior to yours, and yet a third kingdom of bronze, and again citing the different metals which shall rule over the earth. And there shall be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, just as the iron crushes and smashes everything, it shall crush and shatter all of these. And that was thought to connect the whole story to Cyrus. The notion that there would be all of the kingdoms and all of the threat that Israel had faced would come down. And because the Babylonians were, in other words, they would have several attacks on their empire, but it was the fourth one that would take them down. And so even though the king doesn't like this, in 46 of chapter 2, we see that they're promoted. So again, they're faithful, they say what they need to say, they do what they need to do, and they're promoted. Chapter 3, the golden image. This is the one I was trying to sing, and embarrassed myself with looking like a evangelical Christian kid in the 80s who wasn't allowed to listen to music. But the idea behind it is King Nebuchadnezzar erected a statue. And at this point, if you're looking at it chronologically, you're like, hey, like this is twice now that he says the king of the Israelites is good to go. Why is he still doing this? Like, what's going on? But what happened is that he had some folks who were not happy because these 4 Jewish guys were rising in the power of the Persian government. And so they convinced the king to build a statue and said everyone had to worship it. And if they didn't worship, they'd be thrown into the fire. And when they didn't worship, and this was, the image of like everyone bowing down and worshiping, and these 3 Hebrew boys just standing there, like, yeah, I'm not doing that. And so they throw them in, and I love it. In 21, it says, so the men were bound, still wearing their tunics, their in my translation says their trousers and their hats and their other garments, and they were thrown into the furnace of blazing fire. So they were, I just like, this is the first mention that I know of in the Bible of anything of some symbolism of pants. So they had trousers on. So I thought that was interesting. This is very early in human civilizations. They already figured out how to construct pants, I guess. So, but as the story goes, they get thrown into it. They don't get burnt up. There's a 4th figure in there. Daniel wasn't in there with them. They bring them out. They don't smell like smoke or fire. And the king says, clearly the Israelite God is the king, and, amazing. And we're just gonna, and we'll worship, it makes it okay. The king promoted them to the province of Babylon. And then not only that, but it says he makes a decree: any people, nation, or language that utters blasphemy against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb to limb, and their houses laid ruin. And there is no other God who is able to deliver in this way. So again, Nebuchadnezzar is acknowledging this God of Israel, but yet seems to still, for some reason, fall into this sort of judgment seat where he's got to make a decision. Chapters 4 and 5 kind of parallel each other. One talks about Nebuchadnezzar's pride, and one talks about his son Belshazzar's pride in chapter 5. Both of them have sort of a visionary feel, and Nebuchadnezzar repents, but Belshazzar does not repent. And Nebuchadnezzar is restored to his kingdom in this, and Belshazzar is not. And in this, the thought is, the idea is that, again, that sense of if you're doing good and you repent, you'll be blessed and restored. If you're not, and it actually uses the imagery, you have a wild beast or being subhuman, that for a season that Balthazar was left to become a wild beast. And so it captures, again, kind of it differs from the other narratives about Daniel in that it takes a different form, but it presents the same argument of blessing and curse in chapters 4 and 5 together. Chapter 6, maybe this is the one that plots Daniel, Darius. It says, it pleased Darius to set over the kingdoms 120 satraps stationed throughout the whole kingdom and over 3 presidents, including Daniel. And so they were trying to get Daniel in trouble, and they said that if Daniel didn't, if he didn't, they complained about him, and they said they couldn't find anything wrong with him. They brought him before the king, and he said that he wouldn't acknowledge the king, and so that Daniel got thrown into the lion's den. And as you know, Daniel did not get eaten by the lions, and stayed down there. And when he was saved from it, again, you have this thing that comes around in verse 25. Then King Darius wrote to all the people in the nations of every language throughout the whole world: may you have abundant prosperity. I make a decree that all of my royal dominion people shall tremble before God of Daniel, for he is a living God, enduring forever. And so again, you see the same cycle of the fact that there is a challenge, and then Daniel, or the hero, is exalted, but in some sense it's done by miraculous nature in each one of these. Some by changing in the king's heart, but the fire and the lion's den, there is this sort of God intervening in a very unique way, or the Spirit of God being present in a unique way. So those are the legends of Daniel, or the stories of Daniel that characterize, that were written about him, and again were thought to be added back over throughout the years. Before we get into the visions, is there any questions about the stories of Daniel?
No, I don't think so.
No? they almost read independently. You got to read 4 and 5 kind of together if you don't think about it, but they kind of parallel each other. But they all say the same thing. In different periods they would have been used different ways. All right. If you go to 7, this is the beginning of the second part, and again, this is where it shifts. What is it from 7:4, 7:2 is where it switches back to Hebrew. And so Daniel has a vision of 4 beasts: a lion, a bear, a winged leopard, and some just sort of massive beasts with horns. And this is where you get some of the this chapter. You get the language of Son of Man that Jesus uses. And one of the main ways Jesus signifies himself, although he would be considered by the epistles as the Son of God, Jesus' self-designation was the Son of Man. You get the term the Ancient of Days, which is one of those Christianese type things that people use, and it's really a vision just of what is ahead in judgment, and then he interprets it himself from 15 on. As for me, and they're hard to kind of get into because they're somewhat detailed in their own and each and of themselves. But in essence, it's judgment on the nations that come, and then Daniel talks about these beasts, and the nature of the sort of future, and basically in very metaphoric or allegorical terms, paints the picture of a kingdom being torn down and reestablished. In chapter 8, you have his second vision, and that contains a ram and a goat. And again, this is where I feel a little lost because I don't really understand. There's interpretations around what these mean, but they just really fall into some broad category. But the ram represents the Medo-Persian Empire, and the goat represents the Greek Empire, and the goat has some horns, but they fall off but grow a set of 4 of them, but one of them is bigger than the other. It comes out, and horns were often looked at as sort of military powers or force or empires that come up on statues, and they were often placed symbolically to count. So again, there's that notion of that 4 kingdom. And the notion of that evil king that we saw that we guess we didn't really look at it in 7. It talks about an evil king in the attack of Jerusalem and the desecration of the temple. But the idea is that horn in the middle was that power that was rising. So again, the destruction of Israel, I guess, in the essence, is what it is. It's sort of a timeline of the destruction of Israel, of what would happen. Number 9, chapter 9 is Daniel. It's more of a prayer that Daniel offers for the people. It consults. It suggests that he consulted the book of Jeremiah. So obviously, it was written earlier around the time, or just referenced back then in terms of folklore story. But the idea that the 70 years of exile, he would have had access to that number, but if it was written after, they could have filled that in. But that notion would have been, because he basically appeals to God to say the Israelites have suffered enough, and let's give them a break. And then this angel comes down and says, actually, there's too much sin, and I'm going to punish you 7 times that 70 years, putting them in some form of punishment or estrangement from God for 490 years. Beyond the exile, which I didn't add that up, but I don't think that adds up into the time of the second temple, but it would bring them up heartily close to the turn of the millennium. The third vision you can find in chapters 10 and 12, and if you it starts with, in 10, it kind of goes through some of the conflicts of the kings, and then suggests that the king of the north is going to attack Jerusalem, but then he will come to ruins. So it's the sort of the prediction or the prophecy or the vision of the end of times. And then if you look at the in the end of 11, you get the language around sort of the end, and then in 12 you get this notion. And if your Bible has little titles, it says the resurrection of the dead. And so you get, and out of this, you get this vision that has some notion of the dead resurrecting, which is in part where we have visions of this idea of the end times and the dead being resurrected in Christ.
What
and you have
verse
this,
is that? What verse are you on?
the all 12. At the time, where is it? Verse 2, many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth, meaning the dead, shall awake, some to everlasting life and some to shame and everlasting contempt, hence the final judgment. Those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. But you, Daniel, keep the words secret and sealed until the end of time. Many shall be running back and forth, and evil shall increase. And so this, so just the idea that at the end, those who have died and their matter has been turned into dust will have life again and be risen and judged. Do you see that in 2:12, Donna?
Yeah. Does that go along with Paul saying that the dead are going to rise?
Yes, that's what I'm saying. Is that notion of the end times would have been a part of the Jewish understanding of apocalypse, and also where, and this is interesting, in these last 7 chapters, and you'd really have to sort of comb through them in a different way, but it paints this picture that the end times are coming, but the millennialists, just as a theological category, and you've seen this, just to be fair, you have millennialists, meaning that they believe that there will be 1,000-year reign before the final destruction and a new heaven and a new earth are created, where there will be an earthly reign of God's kingdom on the earth. You see it in Judaism, you see it at various points in Christianity, you see it explain. It's kind of what guides or undergirds some of the rhetoric in the last 25, 30 years. I mean, really, probably my whole lifetime. I grew up, having that scare tactic that somehow that the thief in the night, I saw that movie, The Thief in the Night. That's what we saw at church right after our Russ Taff concert. We went and watched this movie, and this, and it was this notion of the rapture, and that presents a little bit different view, because that says that the trial and tribulation will happen. And there's premillennialists, meaning that those tribulation years will come before the millennium, and then there's postmillennialists, who think that those years of tribulation will come after. In the end, a lot of that imagery and a lot of the imagery that feed John's writings in Revelation come from Daniel. It's a trippy book. Even the story, I mean, it's I like the divine miracles, but you kind of think, doesn't King Nebuchadnezzar get it by now? Like, how many decrees, he's making them one after the next. But again, that gives rise to the idea. Some scholars like to chalk up these first 6 vignettes as being more what's called in church history world, or in the historical world, hagiography. The idea that you raise up folklore around characters to build their stature and status and the historical memory. It happens to saints. I mean, there are many things that happen throughout church history in the last 2,000 years, in particular during the medieval period, or sorry, not the medieval period, in the scholastic period. I guess it would have bled into the medieval period, but that are the stigmatas and visions and mysticism. And, as much as I'm all for biblical narratives and things that happened when the Spirit was present there, some of the things that you read about, the extreme fasting, the extreme asceticism, those were all sort of forms that were accredited to people. And the question is, did they actually do that? Or was it something that they were just given and credit? There are some scholars that will say that King David never really killed a bear or a lion, that others did that, and those things were things that were credited to him. It doesn't really make a difference in the end. I mean, I don't really care if King David killed a bear. I mean, it's probably a little cub. He's probably snuck up on a little cub and. So a couple things. What does it all mean? Or what difference does it make? It doesn't really. It really doesn't. It doesn't highlight anything that we've studied anymore. In other words, when I look at this book, what I see is I don't know what to do with the second half, other than that it's sort of prophetic and it's kind of, I mean, I'm not a good apocalyptic sort of reader anyways, so I don't feel comfortable as I don't, not that I don't put weight in it, but it requires the interpretations that I have encountered on Revelations are so far and wide, it really is a crapshoot. And there are things that we could say point, and we can have our own premonitions about what those are. And I kind of find Daniel in the second half to kind of fall into that categories. There are things that we can interpret or extrapolate out of it, but in general, I kind of see it. The interesting thing for me is that the literary facet of, or the teaching, the pedagogical use of those narratives at the beginning, that's where I like to think, how was that used in the history of Israel? Because they weren't necessarily compiled together. They were used to portray what it meant to stand your ground against foreign nations who came in and tried to change your identity, your Jewish identity. And these are 4 characters who stood their ground, and they were rewarded and protected from it. So I think in the end of the day, that's kind of the way I view Daniel, as more of a collection of a moral character building books or stories, plus some trippy stuff at the end. Yeah, Glenda.
But I'm just going to throw out a theory that I had as I was looking through the second part. For one thing, it was reassuring to me when I got to the end of chapter 12, and it says, the angel in my vision then replied, Daniel, go about your business, because the meaning of this message will remain secret until the end of time. Many people will have their hearts and lives made pure and clean, but those who are evil will keep on being evil and never understand. So those visions, I don't know that we are even meant to try to understand them, except in that they say kingdoms come and go.
Yeah. And
ultimately God is in control of all of these kingdoms and powers. And I was reading that some of those kingdoms might have been even the Greek Empire and the Roman Empire, of those, when he's talking about these 4 kings or something. Kingdoms come and go, and all these earthly leaders think they're so powerful, so great. The world revolves around them, but ultimately they disappear, and God is the only one that is in control. And I don't know if we have to take all those visions so literally, except it's just God saying, this is history. This is how human governments rise and fall. And it's not something that we have to be so worried about or anxious about.
No, and I think explicitly, not just they come and go, but in the case of this, some of them will go because of punishment.
Yes.
I mean, you have lots of hints of the New Testament and the gospel in this book. But again, that's only in retrospect when you take the gospel and you reinterpret Daniel through it. But looked at from a Jewish perspective, it gives them, again, that sort of narrative of reinforcing their obedience and allegiance to their identity as Jews and the laws that they've committed themselves to. But I think the other side of that is the promise at the end that other nations will be destroyed, and that their living God that they worship will remain into the end, even though there's much that they don't know.
Mm-hmm.
So I got to tell you, we're getting into, as we move into these prophets, I was reading a little bit just about the minor prophets, just in general, this week. And as we move into these, a lot of these, and this is, we're going to be placing these prophets in around these similar time zones. And so, I mean, not time zones, time periods. And many of them are saying the same thing. And that's the interesting thing is once you start boiling the Bible down to its basics, it's really just a story of God's faithfulness and human rebellion. And it's meant to do for us what perhaps Daniel was designed to do for the Israelites. the book as a whole is really meant to shape us. And we don't really see that because of the fact that we've been introduced to God through a covenant of grace, and they were under the law. So their interactions with God were very, there was a notion of the retributive God that would, punish them for their disobedience. Whereas we don't have that notion. And yet I think generally we probably sin way less than they did way back then. I mean, if you want to put it, or maybe we just judge sin differently.
I think judge sin differently.
And Jim, you probably sin a lot.
Yes,
No,
I do. Thank you.
We sin
Can you tell us some of those things?
No. But pray for me.
we do.
We sin in different ways, and I think, but in some ways the same. But we're not slaughtering people all the time, and
no, we aren't.
right.
but it's happening in other cultures
Yeah.
as we speak.
A lot of idols.
We do.
Yes.
And our idols are a lot of bling and you know,
Yeah.
the material, you know, and honestly, the other side of that, when you step outside the biblical realm, you get into missional theology and the proclamation of the gospel and all these sort of things and the conversations that are happening about what the church is today. And there are many theologians who would say that the church is the church that we find in America that thinks it's vibrant is not at all. I mean, that, you know, mainline religion is stagnant. That, you know, and I don't necessarily want to go as far as to say that I think it has to reflect like a Southern Hemisphere mindset, because I think that you can't go back in terms of the development of civilization and the evolution of thought without destruction. But I think in some sense, we have come to a place where we live in a more enlightened way, and we do consider. I mean, I really, you know, the fact that we have, you know, I remember the first time I saw a TED talk on empathy. If anyone's ever seen, if you type in they do like one of those drawing things where they draw, you know, like, and when you get looking at the idea of empathy and humanity, I don't know if that's something that I think was as widespread 100 years ago, 500 years ago, definitely not, you know. And so the idea that you would torture and, you know, barbarically a man who's just considered a blasphemer and put him up on a cross is something that wasn't really uncommon to them. But it's something that's horrific to us. So, any other thoughts? It's a fun book. It's just, it's the second part's a little strange, but it's, you know, it's worth a read through.
Mm-hmm.
It's worth digging around. All right.
Okay.
No other questions? We'll end a little early tonight then. You can all go celebrate your Cinco de Mayo. Anyone having tacos?
Right.
Tonight? Donna and George, if you ate, you should go to Torches.
I'm sorry, what?
Have you ate tonight yet, George and Donna?
Yeah, we ate.
Oh, you already ate.
It's
Yeah,
a long ways from them anyway.
No,
It's
they're
way
in
on the-
Centennial, I thought.
Way on the north side.
No, there's one in Centennial.
There is one. Oh, okay.
Well, we'll try to find it.
What's the name again?
Torquay's
Torchy's.
Tacos.
I'm going to
Torchy's
find the address
tacos.
when we hang up here and text it to you, Donna.
Maybe when Perry gets back, we'll all go together.
There you go. All right, folks. Well, it was good hanging with you. We'll see you next week as we look at Hosea. Hosea is an interesting one. There's a lot of colorful language about Israel. And so next week, you know, you may want to make it a Wednesday happy hour for that one. Just kidding. All right. We'll see you all later.
All right,
Bye.
thanks.
Thank you.